All right, hey guys, welcome to Friday Night Bible Study. And I'm going to adjust my cabinet here. I knew something was wrong. Okay, here we go. All right, something was wrong. Too far back there. Okay, all right. Welcome to Friday Night Bible Study through the book of Romans, verse by verse. And we're taking this wonderful book, and we are going verse by verse through Romans, through some people call this book that contains the Romans road to salvation. And what they mean by this is they mean I'll put it like this. There are some scriptures, and ultimately, of course, we will get to all of them, but there are some scriptures that you can string together to kind of form a witnessing, okay? A witnessing that, the sinners saved by grace, then kind of saying the sinner's prayer kind of thing, okay? So that's why they call it kind of the Romans, and it's in a lot of these scriptures are from Romans, and we're going to see that too. No, excuse me. All right, so we can just jump right into it. I'm going to say Romans is one of the best books for, as we're doing teaching on salvation. By the time that we're through chapter 8, you would have a thorough, full understanding of salvation, okay? Of salvation. So that's why this book, I think, is important. And I'll say this, it is, from a legal perspective, Romans will let me get it up here, teach us. Paul is going to lay out how we're saved. You're going to know why you're saved. So I don't want to jump ahead, but it will lay out how we're saved. Imagine, I'm going to say, but I'm not going to jump ahead. I'll just kind of sort of get into the study itself. All right, I'm going to go back to verse 16. Paul, in this introduction to the letter, Paul did not start this church. So someone else did, and Paul in his journeys over his lifetime ministry, you have Paul, and he goes from being the arch enemy of believers, of the church, of back then they called it the way, to one of the chief apostles to the Gentiles. Chief in that God selected him, and then we're benefiting as we're studying the revelation that God had given him for the church. And so he had he amassed a lot of friends, okay? His testimony was powerful. The once time enemy of the faith, now champion of the faith. And I say that because, when he would, even just when you go through the book of Acts, when you just go through the book of Acts, and you get to uh, Acts 28, and he makes it to Rome, and you have people coming out to meet him, to greet him. Okay, so I'm saying all of that because it's some kind of way, a friend of his or something like that, kind of put him on to the book of Romans. I mean, the church of Romans, the church at Romans, the believers at Romans. So excited, as he even said, he heard about their faith, right? And so now he's writing them this letter. Now, another reason why he's writing the letter is because he had told them after hearing about their faith that he was going to come and visit them, but never could. And as a result, he kept being delayed, kept being delayed, kept being delayed. And it's possible that the Romans were kind of feeling some kind of way. It's like, what up, Paul? You don't want to come see us? And this is where we are in verse 16. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone believeth, everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then also to the Greek. Now, let me go back and show you why he is saying this. Excuse me. Verse 13, he says, now, I want you to know, brothers, that I often planned to come to you, but was prevented until now, in order that I might have fruitful ministry among you, just as among the rest of the Gentiles. I'm obligated both to the Greeks and barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the good news to you also who are at Rome. Now, again, so he's explaining to him, I'm not avoiding you all. Okay, that's the whole point. I'm not avoiding you all. I wasn't able to get to you until now. And then even now, he had to write the letter to let them know, right, that I'm coming. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. Now, the Greek, of course, was just simply, the Greek was the language of the Romans. Greek-speaking people are the Romans. So he says, for in it God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So this phrase, again, by quoting this phrase, all right, by quoting this phrase, I think I showed you Habakkuk. Let's go there, Habakkuk 2:4. All right, Habakkuk 2:4. Now, Habakkuk, where are you at? Verse 2 says, the Lord answered me, write down the vision, clearly inscribe it on tables, so one may easily read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. Look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity, but the righteous one will live by his faith. Now, the reason why this is important, because we're right in the time of the law. We're right coming up to the Babylonian exile. Okay, and God is warning Israel about their sins, warning them to turn from their sins. They don't. But the fact that he makes this statement here, the just shall live by faith, and of course it's repeated 2 more times in the New Testament. I mean, I think, no, 3 times in Romans, that's what we're studying, Galatians, and then Hebrews. Okay, Galatians, Hebrews, yes. So the just shall live by faith. Now, the reason why this is important right here is because in the Old Testament, here is God declaring the way of salvation. See, the law was never given to give life. It was never given as the way of salvation. And so, because it could not give life. And all the way from here, we see that God is declaring the righteous one will live by faith. It was always by faith that salvation comes. It was always by faith. So when Paul says here that for in it God's righteousness is revealed. Now this word righteousness again is right standing with God, to be in a right standing. Now, sometimes if you have a Costco, right, membership, and I think on there it might say, it may have like a card, and it may indicate member in good standing. If you're not a member in good standing, you don't have the rights and benefits to shop at the store. Sometimes your membership, reunion cards, same thing. Member in good standing. And what they mean by that is, okay, you are in good standing. You're doing everything that you're supposed to do according to the rules, the bylaws, paying your dues, and you are a member in good standing. So now, so that's a good contrast, because again, what does it take to be a good member? First and foremost, pay your dues. Secondly, don't do anything, say anything that would violate the union standard, the union's rules. Okay, you can be dismembered. You can be your membership can be revoked if you do certain things. So when he says the statement here, for in it God's righteousness is revealed, and this is the question, every denomination fails because they teach a false righteousness. Every denomination, every one of them. Now that's not to say everyone in there is that way, but the denomination itself, by reason, by reason that they're denomination. In other words, denominations exist to be divisive. That's why you have them. The initial Protestant movement broke away from the Catholic Church. Thank God. Because the Catholic Church was not teaching God's righteousness. And it's important that we understand how these words should register for us, right? It's important how these words, how they should register. There should be something inside that register. And what is it? What is being right in God's eyes? Right? Well, how does that? How do you now watch this? How do you be right? Well, the only way you can know that, is in the gospel, because the gospel has the power of God for salvation. How? To those who believe. Because in the gospel, it also reveals how to be right in God's eyes. How do you be, when you say, I'm going to be right in God's eyes, how did that look? Well, the gospel, not Catholicism, not Pentecostalism, not charismatic, not Methodist, Presbyterian, right? We can go on and on and on. Like I say, every denomination does not reveal God's righteousness. It reveals how to be in the denomination. That's how, that when you're talking about God's righteousness, well, that's what the denomination do. And as I said, when you go back in the history of denominations, each denomination broke away from something else and formed their own way. And it was and here's the thing, it wasn't all good, because basically you just brought baggage from wherever you were coming from. So you take Protestantism. So Protestant as an entire group, right? Because you have the church, and the Catholic Church is the mother church. That the Catholic Church over 1,000 years ruled Christianity. And they're just so full of heresies. They're full of false teachings. Now, do they believe in Jesus? Yes. Do they believe in some of the essentials of the Christian faith? Yes, they do. Right? But it's not the essentials that they believe in is the problem. It's all of the other crap that they teach and espouse that's a problem. Mariology, the sacraments, the idea of God dispenses His grace through the sacraments. That's a false teaching right here. So people think that when I take communion, God is dispensing grace through that. See, that's a false teaching. And they taught it for over 1,000 years, and that's why it is so ingrained in Christianity. All of the baggage of Catholicism is so ingrained in the mindsets. So when the Protestant break happened around 15th, 16th century, okay, they brought in a lot of baggage from Catholicism. So when you look at pretty much every denomination, this is why you see the same garbage. They put on they have to dress up in their robes. And the clergy have to don all this other stuff, and they have to do all these rituals, right? All the rituals and stuff that they call Sunday service or sacraments or whatever. They got to do all this stuff. Baby infant baptisms and all that kind of stuff. All of that baggage they brought from the Catholic Church. So what happened? So you broke away from the Catholic Church and you brought the baggage with you. So then after the Protestants formed, then certain denominations broke away from other denominations and formed their own denominations that soon, this is why we have the mess called denominations. And rarely do any one of them ever teach the Word of God as they ought. They teach some, but not all. So then, this is what Paul says here. The gospel has the power to save through faith. And then why? Because in it, the gospel reveals God's righteousness. Now, in our journey, see, we're going to be able to debunk a lot of Christian doctrine, especially when it comes to salvation. So here's one. Once saved, always saved. Do you know how many Christians argue that you are not saved? That you're truly not saved? I keep, there's a video that I tell you. In fact, you know what? Watch this. I'm going to show you something right here. I'm going to come out of this for a moment. And I haven't played it in a while, but I do keep this video around, especially as we are teaching in the book of Romans. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is salvation. So, where is it? Here it is. Listen to this. Listen to this.
I am not perfect. I am progressing. None of you will know if you really saved until you take your last breath.
All right, that was Pastor Marvin Sapp, and I don't know why he He smiled at that. But it's a false teaching. It's false. It's false. And he teaches that because of the denomination that he's a part of. But the denomination that he's a part of does not teach the gospel. You can't make a statement like that and understand, get this, the gospel. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. That's not the gospel what he taught. He's teaching works. That you have to live good enough, accumulate good enough works, and then cross your fingers that when you die, when you get over it, you wake up on the saved side. That's not the gospel. Now, I'm not going to pick on him. That video caught my attention a while, and that's why I say I keep it. Because, see, most of Christianity thinks that. Not whether it's Catholicism, whether it's, in his case, I think it's Pentecostalism. Most Christianity, most denominations, they believe that. They believe that. Most of them do. Most of them believe that. And so that's not the gospel. Now on the other side, there's what's called Calvinism. They're not teaching the gospel because they believe that God in eternity past, before the foundations of the world, already selected those whom he saved. In other words, those he wanted to select. So, you don't know if you're in that number. Let me come out there and show you this, one of my pictures here. One of my images that I like to show. And let me show you this. I gotta find it here. Here we go. All right, so I like to show you this image here. So here is an image like here that of Calvinism, and basically what they teach in a nutshell is that before the foundation of the world, you see the picture of those closest up on the hill? Well, they represent the chosen. And of course, Calvinists think and hope they're the chosen. Before the foundation of the world, God already chose them. And Jesus only died on the cross for them. Now, the ones on the bottom of the hill, see, the bottom of the hill, they're not chosen because God didn't choose them. So the people at the bottom of the hill have no hope, never had hope, never will have hope because God didn't choose them. They are eternally damned because, okay. All right, here we go. So, let's go back. All right, so but see, all of that, doctrines of men, because notice he says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." You cannot have either view if you're truly teaching the gospel. Now, we're going to get into that, especially later on in chapter 3. But he says, but the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Watch this. To everyone, notice, not chosen, as Calvinists teach, but to everyone who believes. Not who works, that every other denomination teach. That everyone, it is the power of God. The gospel is the power of God to salvation. So you have to hear the gospel in order to produce what? The power of God for salvation. And then why? Because in it reveals God's righteousness. The gospel reveals what does it take to be right in God's sight. So he says, From faith to faith, just as it's written, the righteous shall live by faith. And that statement goes all the way back in the Old Testament. It goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him for righteousness. So we're going to break this down more. So now, having said the gospel, Paul is like, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it is God's power to salvation. So you shouldn't be ashamed either. You shouldn't be ashamed of your faith because what? It is God's power to salvation, for salvation. Now, verse 18, Paul is going to kind of switch up here. He says, for God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, and unrighteousness of people, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Now, we get into a very unpopular teaching. Notice he says God's wrath. In fact, the teaching can be so unpopular that there's a kind of I want to say slur. I'm gonna say the slur. They used to call them fire and brimstone preachers, or fire and brimstone preaching. and some, but you have these preachers that would preach, and one of the problems with the fire and brimstone preachers is that they own that's all they preached. That's kind of the problem, and you still have them today. Holiness churches, basically all they teach is they don't teach the gospel that saves. They just preach against sin. And by the way, that Pastor South kind of comes out of that group. He doesn't necessarily teach holiness, but that's the background. That's his background. He's not that far from it. And so but they so this idea of preaching against sin, the old holiness way, crying out cry loud and spare not, tell my people their sins. And I'll tell them, I don't even think they really understand the context of the verse, because they were speaking to Israel. Just like when we read in Habakkuk, and I said that you're coming up on a time when God was warning the Israelites to turn from their sins, turn from their wickedness. They didn't. And he began to prophesy to them that Babylon was coming, and which eventually did and leveled Jerusalem. So that's kind of the context. When you talk about the fire and brimstone, they usually kind of take those verses, but that's what he was talking about. Now, there's a greater context. There is a greater context, and this is something we have to understand, because now we get criticized as believers. There is a greater context to hell, fire and brimstone. And so as we now live in this time, notice he says, God's wrath is revealed. So along with the gospel, there is God's wrath. So when he said that is equally part of the gospel message, God's wrath. Okay? So when we say we are saved, and the word saved means to be delivered, I think I told you all, I know I'll keep going back here, but let me show you this sign that and it was now a number of years ago. I was very young. I was coming home from work. It was I'd work midnights, and I was coming home from work, and look at this here. See this? I saw a sign. I saw this sign like this. It said, saved from what? And that's how it looked. That's how it looked. no who wrote it, no scripture verse reading. It said that saved from what? And but I thought it was a good question. And what was interesting is that the several people who the possibilities who could have wrote this. Saved from what? Right? It could be atheists being kind of right, being a slur. Say, what are you saved from? Or it could be Christians. Saved from what? And that's the interesting thing, because the idea of what are we saved from? We are saved from God's wrath. That's what we're saved from. We are also saved to a whole lot of good stuff. So there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance of preaching the wrath of God plus what we are saved to. Now, here is the interesting thing. I'm not bothered by the wrath part. Hell, God's wrath, hell, it scares the heck out of me, right? I think about at the age of 17, had I died at the age of 17, that I would be in hell right now. Because I was in sin. I wanted to be in sin. I did not want God. I wanted as much sin as I could possibly get into. Now I'll say God in his mercy did spare me from how bad, from bad becoming worse and worse and worse and worse, right? But I want in my heart, no doubt in my heart, I wanted sin. And that's why I say I was accountable had I died, because I would have been rejecting God. Like, when sometimes when people would kind of try to witness to me, no, I'm good, right? Um, Sunday morning back then, Sunday mornings was some of the TV stations would have gospel programming. The first couple of hours of Sunday morning, then they would get to the games and stuff. That was my time to sleep through. If I didn't even know about Christian television. There was there was Christian television back then that was just kind of really getting up. Christian networks like that. For example, TBN. I know CBN. They were around, but I never knew they existed because it just wasn't interested. If I was flipping through the TV, I would have flipped right through them. I did not want God. I wanted sin. So my thing is that I think that so I was accountable. I mean, I was really rejecting God in favor of sin. Now, I certainly did it in ignorance. I did not have a hatred from God. Now, I'm always amazed that there are people today who have a hatred for God. I didn't have a hatred. I just wanted sin. But I think if I had died, I would have been in hell. And that's frightening to me. I can't think past that. You know how they say if you're dreaming and you fall off a cliff, you wake up before you actually hit. I don't know if that's something in the psyche or whatever, but that's the same way when I think about hell. I can only think about hell so far. I can only go so far when I go, okay, I'm out, unplug. It is frightening, and a lot of people, I'm talking about non-believers, have a problem with the ideal of wrath. And so therefore it stirs anger in them because when we preach God's wrath. Now there are people now that mock it. They mock the notion. They will say, well, how can a loving God send people to hell? And by the way, we're going to answer that. How can a loving God send people to hell? And or the concept of hell, like I say, atheists will make fun of the thought, see the concept, because they think it's foolishness, and unintelligent, right? That's their that's what they're making fun of. But when we go back to that question, saved from what? From God's wrath. Well, why do we need to be saved from God's wrath? That becomes then the other question. And this statement right here tells us God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people. Now get this, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So right there is the reason that's the answer. People who suppress the truth, people who reject the ungodliness. So God's wrath is not just indiscriminate, it is discriminate against ungodliness, or godlessness, as it's saying here. But I keep saying ungodliness because that's the King James in me right there. And by the way, after all these years, King James is still in me. It's still in me. I like this translation, the Holman Christian Standard Translation, but still, after all these years, King James always come out. Always come out. All right. So God's wrath is revealed from heaven. Okay, so that it's revealed from heaven against all godliness and unrighteousness. So what is unrighteous? Now he's getting ready to define the terms. Unrighteousness, okay? Later on he's going to define that. But it's important to understand. It's important to understand that when we say why is God judging people? Now, Christians can be some of the most silliest people I've seen. And let me tell you why. You ever watch the tribulation movies? There's a whole lot of them now. There's a few of them, okay? Tribulation Force. If you go all the way back to the early 70s, there were it kind of, I think they started the trend because, of Christian films, right? But they started it. And it was called A Thief in the Night. And then after that, Distant Thunder. And The Thief in the Night, and you have to kind of look at the 70s because it certainly was dating. But the movie was about the rapture. So it was about the protagonist who never got saved, by the way. Again, the Christians, they're just so silly in their writing. But so in the first movie, it's about a dream. And her friends are telling her, you need to accept Jesus in your heart, and she just wouldn't until she wakes up one day and the rapture happened, and she's gone, and they sing this song, I wish we're all been ready. Okay, but they always picture, the way they picture sin is God would be unfair because there's just some good, white suburban people that, the guy's cutting his grass, or he, helps old ladies cross the street. And, the reason why he was left behind is because he just didn't say the sinner's prayer. He just didn't say the sinner's prayer. And then so you see this progression. You come up to what's called the Left Behind movies, and the same thing. The suburban, right, middle class. And they just didn't say the sinner's prayer. And they got left behind. And then it was like, I wish I'd said the sinner's prayer. I wish I'd believed. I wish I'd prayed. Because the sinner's prayer is, I believe in Jesus, by the way. So yeah, if you look at the standard sinner's prayer, which I was telling you earlier about Romans Road, right? But they were like, if I just said the sinner's prayer, then I would have been caught up in the rapture, but now we're left behind. And it's unfair. And when you look at some of the people left behind, you would think, yeah, it is unfair. Why? Because they just didn't say the sinner's prayer. Now, it's true, but again, they give no understanding. Now watch this. The wrath of God is against ungodliness. That's if you want to, if they wanted to write a more accurate scene, you have to say, and it's the ungodliness. And from here to the end of the chapter, Paul is going to define this ungodliness and this unrighteousness, this wickedness, and that's what the wrath of God is. There was another guy. He has passed away a year ago, a little over a year ago. He passed away, and his name was Carlton Pearson. And Carlton Pearson was perplexing to me from this reason. He was a showman. He was the type of person, he was an excellent showman. That's not complimentary to him because he was known for his preaching style. He grew up in Pentecostalism and he ended up in charismatic. I mean, to me, he went from one kind of lie to the next, and he was and then he ended up pastoring a church, and the church was, a mega church. He ended up having these conferences that drew 15 to 20,000 people every year. He had books, song. He was counselor to presidents, a couple of the presidents. I mean, the man had what I would say is a dream life. You know, not so much as the wealth he was wealthy, but the fame. But I mean, to say he was living large, to say he was living his best life was an understatement. And then all of a sudden, one day, I think it was like he just popped up one day. He said he was looking at on the late night show, and what was on TV was, those starving kids in Africa, the bloated stomach and stuff. And he sat there and he watched. He says, "God, why are you sending them to hell?" So that was the question, right? Starving kids in Africa, and he says, "God, why are you sending them to hell?" Straw man, leading question, whatever, right? And accordingly, God answered him and said, "Is that what you think I'm doing? You think I'm sending them to hell? Son, I'm not sending anybody to hell. There is no hell." And he kind of came up with this doctrine or this theology of inclusion. So it kind of went from one kind of bad theology to worse theology. And that was bad. Even like, some of the word of faith people hanging around with, the healing people, the prosperity people that he was hanging around with said, "That's too much for us, brother." And he ended up losing everything. He lost that church, he lost everything, okay? And he held that until the day he passed away, like I say, and he held up to the end. And I often wonder why he held to such a doctrine, but he was hardened in that. And the reason why is because he would never explain verses like this. Never explain verses like this. If you say that no one is going to hell, and his logic is this. His logic is that Jesus died for everyone. But this statement, remember, is after the gospel being revealed. So what happens when you don't? And his theology is that it doesn't matter, God still saved you. So literally, a lot of times, I know I get this. People will say, "You know what? You in your grace gospel, you give people a license to sin." Well, his theology literally gave people a license to sin because guess what? You could be the worst sinner, and of course, according to his theology, well, I live right because God saved me anyway. So again, but it was a very, very wild, strange theology. And the reason why I say that is because people have a problem. It's hard for them to grasp the notion of God's wrath because it's forever and ever. But here you don't have to go. See, remember I told you I can only think so far about hell, but I don't have to go. I can click it off because you know what? This for God's wrath is not me anymore. I'm good in God's grace. See, I'm good in God's grace. So by people arguing, fighting, all that kind of stuff, I'm good to go. And we're going to get into that more next week. We'll get into that. As we get into God's grace, the grace of God, okay, and Paul is going to give us man's depravity. And when you understand that, you'll understand why. See, you'll understand why God's grace is just. I'm sorry. His grace is just. I'm talking about his wrath. That God's wrath is just. Why it is deserving. For whatever reason, even Christians, we like to paint over the ugliness of man's depravity. And that's why I said if you watch all the Christian movies, I agree. Watching those movies, it's like, man, God is unfair. Why is God, why is God punishing these good people? Because they just didn't say the sinner's prayer. But it's a lot more deeper than that. All right, guys. We'll pick this up next Friday night in our study through the book of Romans, verse by verse. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I'll see you next Friday in our study through Romans.